Thanks very much to everybody for joining us here today. My name is Amanda Lewis. I am the director of UIC's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and I welcome you here today on behalf not only of IRRPP, but also the Institute on Government and Public Affairs to this very important conversation today to discuss the findings of this new book by Maria Kriesen and Kyle Crowder. IRRPP and IGPA are both honored to help support this event as they both serve as key drivers of UIC's mission as an urban public research university to mobilize the university's most accomplished public policy scholars to provide the kinds of analysis and information that are essential to having a thoughtful and effective policy discussion locally and nationally. Today we focus on one of the most challenging, the most important challenges facing Chicago today, as we dig into the key findings of the new book, Cycle of Segregation. In a recent review in Jacobin, Douglas Massey, a renowned segregation scholar himself, says of this book, in Cycle of Segregation, Maria Kriesen and Kyle Crowder make a contribution to our understanding of how and why residential segregation persists. Kriesen and Crowder's social structural sorting perspective elegantly and convincingly explain how Black and Hispanic segregation can persist even as minority incomes rise and discrimination, I would insert, supposedly declines. Cycle of Segregation is a remarkable scholarly achievement that revolutionizes our understandings of segregation in America today. I'm setting you up here, Maria. Sorry. There you go. So you're going to be revolutionized in your understanding. Exactly. For me, the importance of this book lies in its ability to help us understand the specific kinds of challenges that face us today. We see many patterns of racial inequity that look the same as they did 40 or 50 years ago, but the mechanisms that produce them are quite different. And understanding that difference and understanding those mechanisms today are crucial for us being able to challenge them. I should also note today is an important date in our history as it marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King. And so I thought I'd help set the tone for the day by borrowing some of his words from his talk he gave about segregation, actually, in London on December 7th, 1964, right before he received the Nobel Peace Prize. In the speech, King talks about trying to develop what he calls a realistic position, acknowledging the significant strides that had been made in the struggle for racial justice, but also noting that many challenges were still to be met. As he put it, we have come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved. And in discussing the situation of segregation in 1964, over 5 decades ago, he offers an analysis from this supposedly realistic position that I think is worth spending 2 minutes on today. And I apologize for not having his rhetorical flourish, but his words are powerful unto themselves. He says, I mentioned that racial segregation is about dead in the United States, but it's still with us. We are about past the day of legal segregation. We have about ended de jure segregation because of the Civil Rights Bill and the Supreme Court's decisions and other things. We have passed the day when the Negro can't eat at a lunch counter or when the Negro can't check in a motel or hotel, but there's another form of segregation coming up. It is coming up through housing discrimination, joblessness, and the de facto segregation in the public schools. And so the ghettoized conditions that exist make for many problems, and it makes for a hardcore de facto segregation that we must grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to deal with it in a determined way. I am absolutely convinced that segregation is on its deathbed, and those who represent it, whether they be in the United States or whether they be in London, England, the system is on its deathbed. But certainly, we all know that if democracy is to live in any nation, segregation must die. And as I've tried to say all over America, we've got to get rid of segregation, not merely because it will help our image, but in the final analysis, racial discrimination must be uprooted from American society and from every society because it is morally wrong. So it is necessary to go all out and develop massive action programs to get rid of racial segregation. Now, I would like to mention 1 or 2 ideas that circulate in our society, and they probably circulate in your society and all over the world, that keep us from developing the kind of action programs necessary to get rid of discrimination and segregation. One is what I refer to as the myth of time. There are those individuals who argue that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. The only answer that I give to that myth is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively, And I must honestly say to you that I'm convinced that the forces of ill will have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And we may have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around saying, wait on time. And somewhere along the way, it is necessary to see that human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that time is always ripe to do right. So this is vital, and this is so necessary. Now, the other myth that gets around a great deal in our nation, and I'm sure in other nations of the world, is the idea that you can't solve the problems in the realm of human relations through legislation. You can't solve the housing problem and the job problem and all these other problems through legislation. You've got to change the heart. If we're going to get this problem solved in America and all over the world, ultimately, people must change their hearts where they have prejudices. But after saying all that, I must go on to the other side. It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law can't change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. So hopefully these words give us all some inspiration for thinking about what role we can play in confronting what MPC and the Urban Institute recently referred to as the costs of segregation, locally and nationally. Doctors Kreisen and Crowder in this important book give us critical insight into what we are up against today and how to, as they put it, break the cycle of segregation. There are long bios for both of them on the sheet that you have at your seat, so I won't take a long time to talk about all the work they've been doing for the last several decades. But let me just honor how hard I saw them working over the last few years to get this book right. Both are extremely careful and hardworking scholars who, for me, are models of folks who take such care because they know that the stakes are high. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kreisen to the podium today.
Thank you, Amanda, for that. I don't know how I can follow the words of Martin Luther King Jr., but everybody just kind of erase those for a moment. Keep the sentiment, but not the eloquence. First, I want to I have one moment to thank everybody who made this event possible. The organizing committee of Rob Braemeier, Marisa Navarra, Andrea Jurasek, Sarah Delgado, Patricia Fran, and Kyle Crowder, who all graciously gave of their time and talents to make this event happen. My graduate student, Max Cuddy, and IGPA's event coordinator, Kathy Sullivan, who truly made this come together. And a big shout out to the John Marshall Law School and Annie Krug for this great venue. And to Yvonne Arenas and Hillary Shore for fantastic design work. And to all of you for taking time to be with us today, especially when, I don't know about you, but I looked out the window this morning and couldn't really believe there was snow on the ground. So thank you for the snow. Maybe my co-author, who I will acknowledge now, Kyle Crowder, brought the snow from Seattle with him. I want to thank him for coming to Chicago, and we welcomed you with the snow, and let you all know that after the event, when we do the Q&A, he will be responsible for answering all the questions. So I won't be party to that. In the debate leading up to the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, one of the co-sponsors, Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, offered a concise summary of the then current state of segregation. We make two general assertions: that American cities and suburbs suffer from galloping segregation, a malady so widespread and so deeply embedded in the national psyche that many Americans, Negroes as well as whites, have come to regard it as a natural condition. And two, that the prime carrier of galloping segregation has been the federal government. First, it built the ghettos, then it locked the gates, now it appears to be fumbling for the key. Nearly everything the government touches turns to segregation, and the government touches nearly everything. Some things have changed. The Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination through its enforcement, though its enforcement has been anemic. There has been a softening of white racial attitudes, and there's been the emergence of a growing black middle class. Add to that the fact that populations in most metro areas have become more diverse, and stable, diverse neighborhoods are less rare than they used to be. But much of what Senator Brooke said remains true today. That's Chicago. Segregation is virtually unchanged, especially in places with substantial black populations like Chicago. To be certain, the drivers of segregation have changed, but racial and ethnic groups still exhibit starkly different patterns of residential mobility, typically remaining in and moving between largely separate sets of neighborhoods. As a result, racially stratified patterns of residential advantage and disadvantage are passed on from one generation to the next. Segregation is continually replicated and sustained from decade to decade in places like Chicago. Most important, this segregation is a key role in the maintenance of broader systems of stratification. And here's just some data. I'm not going to talk through it, but it's just showing the differences. This is national data, showing the differences in the kinds of neighborhoods that African Americans, whites, and Latinos live in. So that it's obviously clearly separate and unequal, not separate and equal. So the government is still fumbling for the keys, perhaps even more so since 2016. So in our book, we advance a new perspective, the structural sorting perspective, whose goal is to answer the question of why people continue to live in segregated neighborhoods. We seek to change the conversation about what causes segregation with the ultimate hope that we can also provide governments, community leaders, advocates, and citizens with a set of keys to disrupt the cycle of segregation. Indeed, one of the key motivations for Kyle and I when we decided to write this book was that each of us had become increasingly involved in conversations and presentations with people like you in this room and your counterparts in Seattle. During these conversations, we became increasingly frustrated with the gaps between the debates and conversations that academics were having and the experiences, insights from those on the ground, working on the ground with these issues. Our work with community partners had us stepping back and asking, what's missing in our debates? We were feeling that the story we were telling was anemic, and that the more we talked to policymakers, nonprofits, agency staff who are grappling with these systems of inequality and the housing markets as they actually operated, the more we felt the story researchers were telling were missing some key things. The story wasn't so much wrong as it was incomplete. So here's the problem with the existing conversation as we see it. The existing conversation is dominated by the big three. They've been almost sort of catatonically focused on these traditional explanations. Segregation comes about because of economic differences between racial groups. Segregation comes about because people simply prefer to live with people that look like themselves. Segregation comes about because of persistent discrimination in the housing market, despite the fact that it's been illegal for 50 years. All of these processes unfold in currently segregated neighborhoods that were intentionally created as such by local, state, and federal policies. If there's anyone in this room who doubts the veracity of that statement, that the current patterns of segregation are the result of social engineering, I recommend Richard Rothstein's new book, The Color of Law. But I digress. Our argument is that in all of these things do matter, economics, preferences, and discrimination. But on top of this, there are the hidden forces that shape segregation because they shape how people end up living where they do. These factors are hidden in plain sight, and they shape how we search for housing, where we search for housing, and how we perceive our options for housing. They're the overlooked and mundane ways in which we gather information about, have exposure to, and ultimately understand our residential options. Specifically, they are the media, social networks, and lived experiences. In the depth interviews, we conducted in-depth interviews for part of our book with a non-random sample. It's not for statisticians in the room. It's not a probability sample of anything. It's a convenience sample. But nevertheless, talked in depth at great length with Chicago area residents about their experiences and perceptions in the metropolitan area. I'm going to be quoting several times from these data that are all Chicago area residents. So in these in-depth interviews, Aaron gave us a pithy and accurate account that really captures the essence of this point. We've been talking to him about his perceptions of neighborhoods and knowledge of neighborhoods and communities throughout the Chicago area, places he knew a lot about and some places he'd never been. After he was done, we asked him, how'd you come to know about these neighborhoods and communities? He said, from what I see, mostly the news, my friends, I don't know, I don't write it down where I get it from. It just kind of compiles in this big old noggin right here. So I'm going to come back to the noggin thing in a minute, but let's start with this idea of where information comes from and how it impacts our searches. Think about the last time you made a move. You probably used your networks in a lot of different ways. You probably asked family, friends, coworkers, where are the good places to live? What kind of neighborhood should I move to? Got any leads on good places with good schools, for example, or units that are open? Family members may have even helped you find the vacant home or the rental for you. But so that's a real direct way, right? Where you're in a search and you say, hey, help me with this. But your social network can also impact your searches because people often, but not always, want to live near their family or friends. Sometimes that's where people don't want to live, but a lot of people want to live by their family and friends. Karen is a great example of this. She said, when asked how she ended up living where she did, my husband and I wanted to stay close to home where she grew up. We're a very, very close family, but we also looked. Let's see what's out west. Let's see what else we can find. We found a house in Lisle that we loved, but it had a foundation issue, and it was too far from my parents. So all of these areas, she's pointing to the western suburbs, we really liked, and we looked, but it was almost like the leash pulling me back toward home. We were used to everything there. We knew where everything was. So that's one impact of our social networks. But there are subtler ways that networks matter as well. Even when we're not actively looking for a place to live, we're being exposed to and gathering information about the metropolitan area. And some of that information flows through our social networks as we live our lives. For example, one woman told us she would consider living in Naperville. She was looking at the map and picked Naperville. Yeah, I'd consider living there. When we asked her how she knew about Naperville, turns out that she didn't really know much at all about Naperville, but it was on her seriously consider list because of what she learned from her boss in the past. She said, when I worked downtown, the last boss I had in my department was from Naperville. Very nice gentleman. Very, 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 very nice gentleman. He had 2 little girls, and he always talked about living in Naperville. He loved it, and he always talked about it. That's the only thing I've heard about that area. But this was enough to make it onto her list. So sometimes our networks tell us about places, but we can also glean information from our social networks, even if we never talk to them about where they live. Joanne makes this point when she was asked to describe what Elgin was like. Elgin? I don't know anything about it at all. My old boss's dad lived out there. She was white, middle class, Catholic. I assume if that's where she grew up and that's where her dad lived, yeah, I think she grew up there. I assume that's at least part of what comprises Elgin. I don't know anything about it. I have no reason to know anything about it. Not like I'd ever moved there, right? So she doesn't really know anything about it, but she uses where her network lives to infer all the characteristics about it. To take another example of how people make these kinds of inferences based on who they know lives in a place, this comes from an African-American woman, Belinda, who has this to say about Elgin. Basically, they're just a general suburbs primarily, I would say, Caucasian. Not a lot of African-American presence from my understanding. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at the stats on these suburbs. People that I work with that I mentioned telling me about this stuff, they're not African-Americans, and they're family people who live in those suburbs. Right, so one ingredient that goes into how we know about our possible places to move are based directly and indirectly on our social networks. And importantly, the key relating to segregation is that those social networks are comprised of people who are from our same racial background, on average. So the result is that the information you get from these social networks likely funnels you into neighborhoods that are segregated because you're getting information from a segregated social network. This slide shows the perhaps unsurprising pattern, but it brings this point home from the panel study of income dynamics, that our social networks live in neighborhoods that have high percentages of our own racial group. Particularly, this is true for whites. So the average white person has social networks that live on average in 82% white neighborhoods. The average African American has social networks that live on average in neighborhoods that are 53% African American, so on. So you get the point that you probably guessed this anyway. So our information and perceptions of communities, though, are also shaped simply by living life. These are the neighborhoods we're exposed to when we do the things we do every day. The places we've lived throughout our lives, the commute we take to work or school, the traveling around we do because we install cable TV for a living, the communities we visit taking our kids to soccer games, wrestling matches, or swim meets. So I want to give you 3 examples that illustrate how people absorb information through lived experiences that are routine, but also not so routine. First, we have Luisa, a Latina living in Little Village. She explained why she eliminated the entire south side of Chicago in terms of her housing search. She said, yes, I mean, all the south side is very mainly African Americans, and now that I drive around there and I go to school around there, I see that it is. So they're the routine things. She drives to school every day in the South Side, and she draws conclusions about what the entire South Side is like. But there's also the not so routine things that shape people's perceptions. So there's Joanne, a white woman living in Wilmette, who talked about her exposure to Inglewood. She says, I've driven through there once by accident, she laughs. I just never felt more conspicuous in my life. The interviewer says, conspicuous because of I was white and no one else was, driving a white German car where no one else does. She laughs. I guess I was just glad it was daylight. How do I get out of here? Where's the closest? How do I get back to where I need to be? Because I was trying to get out over here to get out of town, and I was in this neighborhood and trying to take a shortcut, and that was not very, I don't have GPS. She probably has it now, but at the time she didn't. So you can see this non-routine experience really shaped her perception of this area. My final example of how people's moving through the city impacts how they perceive their options, and in her case, an actual search, Beth explains, I'm a North Sider. I was born and raised on the North Side. Generally south of the 00 line wasn't really a consideration. Not so much because I would absolutely not live there, just because that's what I was familiar with. Once I started working farther south and started exploring more neighborhoods south, that's when I started opening up my search south. So through these routine exposures of working and getting her outside of her normal daily routine, she ended up opening up her search south and ultimately living in a South Side neighborhood. This last quote draws attention to the housing search itself. Beth talks about how she expanded her search further south as a direct result of having worked in the South Side, which opened her housing search up, and added communities into her consideration set that otherwise would not have been there. So now let's talk about this housing search process, because there are a lot of myths underlying that as well, what they look like and what they don't look like. Because to this point, researchers, and I won't bore you with the details, have made very unrealistic assumptions about how people go about searching. First, so I'm going to give three because I do everything in three. The first idea is that housing searches happen in stages. There's what we call the pre-search stage, which is what I've mostly been talking about so far. This is when we're not searching for housing. We're just living life, and we're gathering this kind of information, knowledge, and experiences that ultimately, when we do decide to search, inform that search process. In other words, we're not blank slates when we do a search. We don't walk up to a real estate agent and go, where should I live? And let them tell you. Or we don't go on Craigslist and go, wherever in the Chicago metropolitan area, right? We come with perceptions and experiences that shape that initial search process. So we come into this process with a lot of information that we've gained through social networks, media, and lived experiences. So once we've decided to search, we enter stage one. And at stage one, we're also not considering every possible community in the metropolitan area. We're funneling, we're zeroing in, and that process, that stage one process, is where we take all possible neighborhoods and communities, and we select the 2 or 3 that we're really going to search in, right? So we narrow that process down, that handful of neighborhoods that we're really gonna look for vacant units in. Then within that consideration set of neighborhoods is when we start to look at Craigslist ads for specific apartments or specific homes that are for sale. And then we make a decision, which leads to an outcome. This multi-stage process means we need to ask how those decisions are made at each of those stages, not just act as if the outcomes have come about through careful consideration of all possible vacant units in a metropolitan area. And with regards to segregation, we really need to know about that first stage, where people winnow down from all possible communities to the smaller 4 or 5 communities that they're going to search in, because at that point the geographical stage is set, right? So knowing how people create that consideration set is crucial for understanding segregation, which brings us to a second key point about housing searches. When we move from pre-search to stage one, where we pick our consideration set, we do not have complete information, and that's where academic models are problematic, right? Assume that everybody knows everything about every place. Here's what's going to happen. People are going to go live where they can afford to live, for example. Rather, we suggest there are places that people don't know about. We have blind spots. It's hard to move to a place you've never heard of, right? So what we know is that these blind spots are often racialized. That is, people tend to know about places where their own racial group predominates. So if we think of the case of African Americans, for example, in the blue are the communities that African Americans on average are familiar with in the Chicago area. This is just a sampling of them from a larger study where we asked people if they knew about 41 different communities. So this is just an illustrative example. As you can see, in the blue zone are a variety of communities, predominantly African American, but also racially diverse and some mostly white communities. But check out the blind spots, right, back in the yellow. Extremely white, far-flung suburbs. So we've done this, and in the interest of moving us along, I'm not going to show you the blind spot imagery for each group, but we have, anybody who's interested can email me, I'll send you the paper that talks about this in more detail. But you get the point that different groups have different blind spots, and they are racialized. The third myth that needs to be debunked is that people do not sit down with complete information about every place in a region and do a computer-like calculation, putting all of their information, all of their preferences, all of their resources into an Excel spreadsheet and find the one that scores the highest on all their criteria, and then they move into it. People are not computers. So how do people go through the process of narrowing down all possible options to the 3 or 4 neighborhoods or communities where they'll conduct a more thorough search? To get from all possible places to a few they'll search in, people use shortcuts. What do those shortcuts look like? People use a best queue. If they know one thing about a place, they use it to stand in for a lot of different features. Just one bit of information and people can paint a quite complete picture of a neighborhood, even about places they've never been. Here's an example from Tom, who at the time of our interview had lived in the Chicago area for like 2 months. This was a good gig. He got paid $50 to come to Chicago, to the UIC and do an interview. He was unemployed at the time, but new to the area. Tom pieced together an entire portrait of Waukegan and Gurnee based on a trip to Six Flags a few months earlier. He described these communities as follows. They seem like very settled places, very suburban, very calm, subdued. I don't know. I don't know if they're really upscale, but there's tons of shopping out there. The interviewer says, what's your impression of who lives out there? I think it's mostly like people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who have families, who want to live somewhere that's a bit more quiet. I don't get the impression that's a very diverse neighborhood. So it's mostly white. I mean, it's a nice place to visit for Six Flags and for shopping. I get the impression the schools that are there are nice. The crime is probably pretty low. It's not as densely populated. So based on a trip to Six Flags, he knows he should send his kids to school there, right? It's a whole package. There was not difficult. It was one thread, knew one piece, and was able to paint an entire picture of a white suburb. Other cases, people use their knowledge of the retail, or in this case, restaurant scene, to make conclusions about a community's other features. This is Joanne, the white woman who lives in Wilmette. She's talking about Lincoln Square. My experience is I haven't been in the more residential areas, but as I drive through, and I've been down there to eat and socialize and what have you, it's pretty white. I would say at least 75% white, if not more. The interviewer says, what's the 25% who's not white? It's probably more Asian and Hispanic, maybe not quite as much African American. Just because that's not, generally speaking, their kind of neighborhood. I mean, I know this sounds really racist, but honestly, how many black people do you know go to the bistro? Seriously, I mean, it's a more trendy kind of neighborhood than I like, but I like the feel of it. Right? That's a lot out of a bistro experience. In another section of the interview, Joanne provides a great example of how whites in particular often rely on these kinds of assumptions of how race and class are completely interrelated to draw conclusions about places. Here she's talking about Beverly. I know about Beverly because I know there's a Montessori school down there. I was surprised to find out that it's a pretty wealthy white community because it's on the south side of Chicago. And when you don't grow up here and you don't know these things, you just make assumptions about neighborhoods because it's just easier to make decisions that way. So in many ways, Joanne is the exception that proves the rule. She always assumed that a place on the south side could not be middle class and it would not have white people living there. It was only because it had a Montessori school that she dug a little deeper and had her assumptions upended. But then her last comment reveals that's what humans do. We take shortcuts. In this case, these shortcuts have racialized consequences. For whites in particular, in this case, it's often about a neighborhood that is black that has many undesirable features. But it also highlights something that is true because race is correlated in reality with a host of other features that matter to people. They may rarely search to find the exception that proves the rule. For whites, it could be the black neighborhood or the diverse neighborhood that has good schools. So this idea of correlated characteristics, and we have to think about how do you unpack those correlations for people. The correlated characteristic that emerges importantly for African Americans relates to whether a place will be welcoming to people of color. The old-fashioned way to think about discrimination, the kind of discrimination that the Fair Housing Act outlawed, is that it happens when a person is denied an opportunity to live where they want to live based on their race or ethnicity by a landlord or a real estate agent. But discrimination, the power of discrimination in the housing market today is more than merely a landlord denying a unit to someone because of their race. It also matters because people develop perceptions of places as being welcoming to people like themselves. We may have heard about a reputation in a particular community with a history of racial discrimination. We can all think of the communities in Chicago that African American in particular have had histories of violence, KKK rallies, and the like. But the perception of discrimination can shape our consideration sets even without any concrete information about instances of discrimination in that community. For example, we asked Russell, an African-American man living in Chicago, about what he would think of living in some of the outlying white suburbs of New Lenox, Mokina, Frankport, and areas like that. He said, "Those places, it seems like a community built for a specific type of family, a specific type of people. I don't foresee many African Americans living there. I think that it's going to cater towards wealthier white families. I never really thought about why I feel like that. I just got the impression like, ugh, that's not a neighborhood that would welcome me kind of thing. Not saying that they would do anything to dissuade me or redline me or anything, but I don't see that it's nowhere I ever considered living." In short, we end up living where we do because we go through a process that is informed by information, perceptions, and knowledge that is constructed by the media, our lived experiences, and our social networks. What is critically important, particularly in places like Chicago that are segregated, is that this process is not race neutral. The information comes through segregated social networks, racially distinct experiences in the city, and racialized media accounts. And as this picture suggests, each of these things, as well as the big three, preferences, discrimination, economics, feed off of each other and self-perpetuate themselves, hence the cycle of segregation. Let me close with another quote from the testimony in the Fair Housing Act. Quote, "The ghetto is self-perpetuating, for by separating the white child from the Negro child, we hand on to both our own dear delusions of race. We are now trapped in a situation where we must push for a miscellany of torturous techniques, from pairing to busing, designed to integrate schools which serve segregated neighborhoods, both black and white. These schools must pretend that Americans live in one world and not two, but the children know better because they know their neighborhoods. The bus from the Negro ghetto in Evanston, Illinois comes every morning to Lincolnwood Elementary School, and the white children on the playground shout, 'Here comes the colored bus.' Neighborhood segregation is thus the sour grape that sets each new generation's teeth on edge. Right now, we're creating another generation of Americans committed in their bones to segregation, not because we are formally teaching it. In many homes and schools, we're actually teaching just the opposite, but because we're living it. Unfortunately, in too many communities with a few minor adjustments, this statement, this description, rings true 50 years later." One last thing. As I mentioned, the framework at the core of this book grew out of our frustration with academic debates that did not resonate with the policy and advocacy context in which we were increasingly engaging. As such, there's also a cycle here, one that involves researchers, the public, policymakers, and program staff. The cycle is one we hope we can encourage and build upon today, as there are members from each of these perspectives in the audience and on our panel. So let's get this cycle in motion to disrupt the cycle of segregation.
Thank you so much, Maria. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, but for those who don't know me, my name is Patricia Fran with the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance. So in order to further contextualize this truly fantastic research, we're now going to hear from individuals with lived experiences of making intentional housing moves to further integration. And as you can see from that presentation, that is no easy feat by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to invite up now Andrea Jurasik from Housing Choice Partners, as well as Catherine Johnson, Program Manager at Housing Choice Partners, and Chanel and Gloria Washington, clients of Housing Choice Partners, Michelle Rodriguez from Oak Park Regional Housing Center, and Cheryl Wisniewski, client from Oak Park Regional Housing Center. Thank you.
So in this discussion, as Patricia explained, we're going to be bringing to life some of the themes from the book that Maria has described. Here we have clients of the Oak Park Regional Housing Center and Housing Choice Partners, Michelle Rodriguez-Taylor, Gloria Washington, Cheryl Wisniewski, Chanel Washington, and Catherine Johnson. Oak Park Regional Housing Center and Housing Choice Partners, as Patricia described, both try to make integrative moves with clients, but are working in two very different worlds, I guess you could say. Oak Park Regional Housing Center works with many market rate tenants or unsubsidized tenants, and Housing Choice Partners works primarily with voucher holders. So we administer the Housing Mobility Program for the Chicago Housing Authority. But these are both models that are working to broaden clients' ideas of where they can live and help shape housing searches. So we're not going to get into sort of the structural or systemic barriers that face each of these clients. Instead, we're going to look at perceptions and lived experiences and how those shaped their housing searches. And then also how the organizations both played a role in helping to broaden those perspectives. So let's start with Cheryl and Michelle from Oak Park. Cheryl, when we had talked previously, you were moving from the southwest suburbs and looking to find something new, and you had initially were looking in Chicago. So tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Yeah, so I grew up for the most part in Homer Glen, so that was, around that New Lenox, Mokina area that the gentleman was talking about, and he's not wrong, which actually was part of the reason, excuse me, that I really, so I grew up there, one way to school, came back home as many kids do, and then needed to leave. So yeah, I was looking in Chicago initially, was really looking for something, an area that was more diverse of people of every background, which my hometown was not. So what helped me, I guess, sort of, or not helped me, but informed my search a lot was actually my dad, which we talked about previously. And my dad was an ex-Chicagoan, grew up on the South Side, and his advice, and I trusted his advice as well because he's traveled a lot for work around the Chicago metropolitan area, and so he had a much better idea of what was out there than I did in terms of what different communities were like. And I think everybody my age at that point wants to move to Chicago, and I think probably most of the North Side is all suburban transplants at this point. But based on my income and based on his perceptions of what the city was like for a single white female in her early 20s, that really that conversation influenced me to look to Oak Park. On his recommendation, we're also, based on income, based on the perception of what the city was like in certain areas, based on safety, and based on politics, actually, but that's another thing. So yeah, I think that was a big factor in me coming to Oak Park.
And once you got to Oak Park, what were your perceptions?
I think it was. I mean, I've been there now for 15 years, so I guess it was a pretty good perception. I started in the downtown area and really enjoyed it. I ended up I enjoyed living in the area and living in Oak Park and what Oak Park had to offer in terms of people of different backgrounds, in terms of things to do. And then I ended up going to the housing center to relocate after not a great first year. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm veering off here.
No, you're fine. No problem.
I'm veering off the question.
Yeah. And so once you went to the housing center, what was your process like there, and where did you end up moving?
So I ended up moving further west. My process with the housing center was great because there are definitely preconceived ideas, just as there are in the city, in the suburbs, everywhere. There's even within a town or within a village, there's still preconceived ideas of where to move and why and where you should not move. And the housing center process was great because the people would take you out to the apartments and kind of steer you into areas where you may not be thinking of, and somebody may have literally, in my case, literally said, you don't want to move there. So there was an individual, Charlie, I don't know if he's still with the housing center, but He took me to different apartments on Austin, was telling me about the area. He actually lived in an apartment around the corner from Austin, and there was an apartment in his building, so he was taking me through the building and telling me about the culture of the building and just what was going on in the area. And so it's much more than an apartment finding service, if you will. It's just really education on the community and about, you know, diversity and the dispelling a lot of those misconceptions that get put forward that often are just often not addressed.
What kind of reactions did you end up getting from people once you moved to that neighborhood? Family, friends, people at the gas station?
I think, I don't know that there was too much of a reaction. So I ended up moving once again even further west, over into the arts district, just about a block and a half off of Austin. And I think that's when people are like, are you sure? And my car was parked, just off of Austin. So there definitely, I think once I moved into that apartment, further west, I think there were a few more like, watch out at night maybe, or coming off the blue line, I think there were a few more, comments of concern from people, but it's also my job to address those in return. So
Sure.
I'd say no, it's fine.
So can you pass the mic over to Michelle? Thank you, Cheryl. So Michelle, just generally speaking, what are some of the perceptions or assumptions you hear, or the staff here, as people are coming into the housing center?
Right, well, it's a regular occurrence at the housing center for people to come in and have preconceived notions of where they want to live. And I don't know if it's conscious or not, but a lot of that is based on where they think people who look like them live, based on race. So a lot of times people come in and, they're saying, we want to live in Oak Park, it's a wonderful community, but not on Austin and not east of Ridgeland. So, and our staff are, trained to respond to that, and we like to expose them to other possibilities. Because Oak Park, we don't feel that there's one bad place to live in Oak Park. It's only about a 4-mile square, village. And so what we really do is help them not only expose them to different areas that they may not have considered, but also, like Cheryl had said, we will take them out and meet people, meet the neighbors. A lot of our staff live east of Ridgeland, some of them on Austin, some of them in Austin. And I think when people come and they see other people that look like them too, and that they're healthy and happy, and they're like, oh, well, I live right down the street from you. And that helps open some of those possibilities. Now, unfortunately, it happens too that they leave our office all gung-ho and found an amazing apartment, and then someone at the diner or something where they're eating, picking up lunch, and they're excited, oh, I'm gonna live in Oak Park, I found a great, apartment, and then someone would just say, oh, you don't wanna live there. And then that's sometimes all it takes for them to come back in and say, you know what, on second thought, and we're like, wait, you love this was a great location, it was an amazingly beautiful apartment, and that's what we're up against.
So at that point, do you just start covering people with statistics, or how do you work to kind of counter that perception?
I think really it has to do with the relationship building, right? Because all of those preconceived notions and biases were formed somehow from people that they've known and people they've come into contact with. So then when our staff take them out and say that this is a great place to live, and a lot of times they do. We had one woman, she was an empty nester, and she sold her home, and she came in, and she hadn't thought about living east. She didn't say no east of Ridgeland, but we just, okay, these are some possibilities based on the criteria you've given us. And she ended up falling in love with an amazing apartment on Austin. And she came back just giggling, saying, my kids are gonna think I'm crazy, you know, because her kids had that perception too. But she was just like, you know what? I love it. I'm moving there. This is great. It's, you know, yeah.
So, do you ever see a trickle effect with families or social networks as one person moves, another person maybe later comes into the center and asks for help?
Yes, actually, just last week we had someone, and her mother was a client of ours, and then she came in, and I mean, and Cheryl too. Those are the wonderful clients that are just open and you know, willing to just like, yeah, this is great, or sincerely believe in the mission not only of the housing center but of the Village of Oak Park and what we're trying to create there. So yeah, then we had this daughter come in also looking, and she was just like, oh, I've lived on Austin, oh, I lived on East Ridgeland. So it was like, oh, yes, this is going to be, you know, just, it's going to be nice to find her someplace.
Wonderful. Well, that sort of helps us transition into our next panelists, Ms. and Miss Washington. Gloria is mother, Chanel is daughter, and Catherine has had the opportunity to work with both organizations that these women worked with. Gloria Washington, you were a client of the Leadership Council through the Gautreaux Mobility Program after that lawsuit and settlement back in the 70s. And Catherine, you were not working with the Leadership Council then, correct? Yeah. You were about 5 years old then. But you had a chance to work as a counselor with the Leadership Council, and now, of course, you've been working with Housing Choice Partners as a counselor and manager. Ms. Washington, tell us about your experience. So you started in Englewood and ended up eventually moving to Schaumburg.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about your perceptions of your move initially. So I know a few years ago.
2 years ago. I'm going to start out saying that I'm very nervous, and my staff will be shocked to know that I'm nervous. They will enjoy this. Nervous, and I'm surprised. I was with the Leadership Council program, and I had just went through a not a good separation. I had 2 little kids living in the Inglewood area. Did not have any family support at all. You know, even though I had 8 siblings, and my mom, I wasn't getting any financial help. There wasn't any child support, and there was really nowhere to go. I just was lost, and I don't know, for some reason, it's not figure out. I always wanted a good life, even though I lived in poverty all my life. You know, my mom, you know, raised all these kids. In my mind, I always wanted a great life. I wanted to dress different. My mom always told me, "You're so different from the rest of the kids. What's wrong with you?" And I guess we didn't say born that way then, but I'll say that I guess I born that way, wanted a good life. And I got, back in those days, 1985, I'm telling my age, you have to get on the phone, and we was trying to get the, you know, Leadership Council. We finally got through. It's like a lottery. We got it. Then they let you know that, you know, you have to, they give you a number or whatever. She would know how it goes, remember. And got in contact with me and everything, and it took me just a few months, I guess, or less. And they told me they had an apartment for them. They interviewed me, and they came to my home, you know, 2 people, and we talked, and then they said, you know, we have a place in Schaumburg. And I said, Schaumburg, a beautiful apartment in Schaumburg and Willie. And then I was so sad. And then my ex said, well, you gonna move to Schaumburg? Oh, yeah, I'm gonna move to Schaumburg, they said. And I was crying for a while, and I told these guys about the situation. And they said, why are you crying? I said, they moved me to a car dealer. You know, I only seen it on television. and when the management called me, and she said, why are you so sad? And I said, I don't understand why they moved me to a car dealer place. I want an apartment, but I want to move to a car dealer. They said, no, it's an apartment in Schaumburg. I never heard of Schaumburg. And then they brought me out there with Chanel, a little bitty girl, and Sean, a baby, he had just born. And I went out there on that metro train, didn't know where I was going. They met me at the train station. And I had 2 cars. My husband did, but I didn't know how to drive. He always told me that, I'm not gonna teach you how to drive because I'm afraid you might die. And And I don't want that to happen. I lose you. Well, he ended up passing away 3 years ago, later in a bad car. I mean, I'm sorry, a bad fire, a tragic fire. And I was stuck with 2 cars and did not know how to drive. He took me to Schaumburg, and I was like, wow, it's beautiful here. First it was Wheeling. They said, no, we're not gonna put you in Wheeling because you don't know how to drive and there's no bus transportation. So they take me to Schaumburg, and it was just gorgeous. I loved it and everything. And they said, would you like it? And I explained about the car door place. They said, oh, okay, no. And then the management there, he said, you know what, he said, some people, when he was really like, oh, wow. He was from Texas. He said, I want to let some of these people come out here and live in my garage. He said, but you look different. Back in the day, I was on kind of pretty side and everything back in the day. And he said, you're a pretty girl. So, I would let you okay and everything. I'm like, I was actually about all this. What is this? So then, anyway, I ended up getting the place. And he said, but they reminded me, you know what? You're going to be the first, among the 4 people, the first black here. And I said, really? That didn't affect me. I was like a Curious George. I wanted, wow, that's what's wrong with that? I was very naive to a lot of things. That's why I think I got through Schaumburg, because I didn't mind being the first. I didn't think about it. I didn't care. And I always see people, as all my employees are Caucasian. I never see race. I think that's what helped me through life. I go by your own merit.
Sure.
Person you are.
So once you got out to Schaumburg, what did your perception
I was scared to death.
Yeah.
I was alone with 2 little kids, could not drive. I had to find out about the dollar ride. I learned the dollar ride. It was a great experience. I had food stamps at the time, which I hated because they had the paper. And when you didn't have change, you know, I stopped taking every time I go to a store, I would take a calculator with me to count up to the dollar, you know, $89.92, you know, like that. You know, I hated it, you know. And I tried to give them up. They said, no, 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 you have to think of the little kids. I said, but I'm working a part-time job and I'm in college and everything. It was very embarrassing. We got change for food stamps real loud. It was very embarrassing. A different time. And one day I just went down to the office and just got off. And I survived from there. I did very well. I finished school, everything, and continued to work, but it was very difficult.
And you ended up staying out there?
I stayed. I never wanted. If I go to the city, if I drive, they have to give me directions. My family, and they get very upset about it. Like, you was raised in the city. I don't know. They get really biggity. You get real raised in the city. Now you act like you don't know how to get places, and I don't even ask them anymore. I just go around and around in circles and get stuck here. And I don't and I used to take the bus all the time. The 606 bus all the way there. That take it forever with 2 little kids. And the problem was my family was a little envious, you know, angry with me for moving out here, you know, to get a better life. I've been out there 35 years, something like that, and my mom visited me once. And she came in 1986, and the whole time she kept looking out the window. I'm gonna have to get back home. I can't be out here. I can't be what? You know, so my family, out of all my siblings, 8 siblings, they visited me maybe twice. And that's very difficult. I made my own world.
Sure.
I made my own world in Schaumburg.
You were really up against a lot of...
And I said I would never go back to the city. Now, nothing against the city, but it's difficult there now. It's difficult in the city now. And I'm like suburbanite, I'm kind of afraid, you know, with the crime, and crime is everywhere, we know that.
Yeah.
But I survived in the suburbs, and I'm retiring July 24th of this year. And I came out there in my early 20s, single woman, 2 little kids, couldn't drive, and now I drive everywhere.
You almost have to,
But you have no choice. You know, I worked at Prem a little bit, teaching kids how to drive, and and it was a nice cop. You remember he told me, I was about 25, he said, let me tell you what you could do. Every morning, get up early, like 5 o'clock, I'll see you pass. I had no license or anything, I just had a permit. He said, drive the Cubs, get your food, and drive back, and you'll be okay, and everything. I said, but I only have a permit. I was very naive person, he said, I won't give you a ticket, you'll be fine, but hurry up and get your license, I'm gonna check you in a couple months and everything. So the cop wanted taking me to get my license.
Wow, that's
In
amazing.
Schaumburg.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of help because of the way I was so innocent, the way that my personality, outgoing, A lot of people helped me, Palatine Township, you know, the adopted families, they help with Christmas for my kids. I never had to buy my kids anything. They pay for everything, okay? Some of our wealthy family would adopt my kids, they would be overwhelming with gifts. You know, they never got me anything, which was fine. I never got any, I think I got a pair of socks always, but they always took care of the children and everything. And one quick story is I was walking down Algonquin and I didn't have any money at all. And it was this new bank, American Charter Bank, I think it was. Well, it's not American Charter anymore, it's last year, it's FB Bank right now, something like that. I walked in there, and like I told you, I was very naive about things. I said, yeah, I would like to speak to someone, I want to apply for a loan. Loan? I had nothing. And he said, you just to walk in. I said, well, why can't I just walk in and apply for a loan? By the time I left out of there, I had a $25,000 loan. I went to a car place to get a car in 1990, and the guy said, you have 3 strikes against you. You single, you black, and you female. I still was like, really? I never seen race.
Yeah.
I never seen that I was single. You know? And that because I couldn't get it because I'm female. And that gave me so much power here. And I rise, and I hope I did taught my kids that I'm very strong. I'm very intimidated to a lot of people when I go around, but I learned the hard way. I had to survive. IEPs for my son, the only person sitting there, 12 people, you know, attacking me, and I had to fight. The only black, and they were like, oh, we're gonna get her, or whatever. Like, I had to think of my children. I kept thinking of my kids. And I always said to myself before I go is that if you go to the bathroom, you equal to me. You're no different.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So, Chanel Washington, you grew up in Schaumburg, and then you became a client of Housing Choice Partners. So you've joined our mobility demonstration program, which is a special mobility program. We'll get too much into it. But, so tell us about where you were living when you came to HCP, and did you have an idea of where you wanted to move to already, and sort of what shaped that view of where you wanted to work?
Well, I was living in Palatine, and it was income-based housing, and it wasn't that good of a place to live. So my kids were really young. Now they're 5, 9, and 8, but they were babies then. And I was looking for a better district, child care, you know, places where, you know, it'd be easier for them. So that's, and also more diverse. The neighborhood I was in, it wasn't as diverse. At first, it was, so you know, that's what I was looking for my children, you know, but the district was the biggest thing, the school district.
How did HCP help kind of broaden your perspective?
They helped really well. They helped to pinpoint. I attended a lot of their workshops, so they helped pinpoint, you know, neighborhoods where it was, you know, better, how, you know, nice area, you know, more diverse. The biggest thing was the school district. That's how they pinpoint the areas that safe, you know, safer for the kids, that with the crime statistics and everything. So that's how I was able to pinpoint where I was going. So yeah, it helped big time. Yeah.
And Catherine, I know you've worked for HCP for a while, and like we mentioned before, you had a chance to work with the Leadership Council. Tell us a little bit about your experiences in terms of perceptions that you've heard over the years, or what you're hearing from clients as they come in the door.
Well, because I've had so many years of experience working with families, I must say that my first experience and perceptions were somewhat different from what I hear now. Over the years, I've heard people talk, you know, of course, people want to stay in their communities where they have their family networks and where they're more familiar. I've had people tell me that, well, black people don't stay in Barrington. And when I first started working with the Cook County program, we had a map in our office where we had dots on our maps where every people would move to. And so that was a great tool that we used with families when they came in and said, well, black people don't live in these areas. And so we would point out, well, we have people in Orland Park and Schaumburg and Streamwood and so forth. And over the years, I think people, our families are embracing the benefits of moving to opportunity areas, but we still hear those same perceptions of neighborhoods where they think they're not welcome. But we, on the other hand, we point out the benefits and we point out the schools. Like in Ms. Washington's case, we're able to show her, better schools in certain areas.
And can you talk a little bit about the tours and taking people around?
That's one of the other things that our staff will provide for families. We provide community tours to different areas so that families see communities. They see people that look like them in communities. We tour different, we show them the libraries and the other amenities in towns and things that are very attractive, and so they then become a little bit more familiar with communities.
Have you seen any differences in the way that counseling is done over the years, and how do you think those differences have come to shape it?
Well, I think that on my part, in the beginning, it was much more difficult because in the late 80s, when Ms. Washington came, of course, it was less people moving to areas. And then as time has evolved, more people tend to, sometimes families follow each other. But we still, I believe that on our part, counseling is a little bit, it has evolved, and families are embracing mobility, they're embracing, we have families that are very, really good when we show them maps and we show them great schools, and they go on the site and they find the schools. So we're trying to change the way families look for housing, and a lot of families are really catching on to that idea.
Yeah, it almost seems as socially it becomes more acceptable to move outside of your neighborhood or to become a little bit more integrated in your room. The Lord really picks up.
I think it's also fear of all people, you're gonna be alone, I think it's a fear also, I never had much fear of things, So it's like I want to move around. I've heard people, I don't want to move out there with all these white people. Well, they have to live somewhat, you too. Everybody's just living. It's nothing to fear. Really, you move around people. Don't step white people, Chinese people, whatever. Like where I live at right now, village, luxury apartment, village in the park. It's all Indians. It's all mostly. And I'm like the minority in the building, but I don't see that. I go in and out. I have a right to live there too, and so do they. They're not bothering me. I'm not bothering them. And so that's the fear. There's so much segregation and separations because I think a lot of blacks don't want to live around Caucasians also, and a lot of Caucasians don't want to live around blacks. And vice versa, all the races. But you have to get past that and say, it's not even about I have the right, because you said I have the right, and you come out there with an attitude or challenge, I'm going to show I have a right. Nobody's bothering you. Just move. And that's how I looked at it. I think so many years ago helped me being so young and what I did. I didn't go out there to cause any problems. I didn't go out there for anything. I just went out there because I didn't like living in Inglewood. I didn't have a husband anymore. I didn't have family to support me. And I wanted to live better. And I found the rent in my daughter's baby bed. It's huge. And that was enough.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go.
Sure.
That life wasn't for me at all. Like I said, I want to live well and everything. So a lot of people in fear of doing so well. It's like a lot of people bring you down. Like, oh, girl, you shouldn't go out there. This is trying to stay with me. Stay down. Stay in this bad neighborhood. Stay right here with me. And a lot of people intimidate, like, oh, if I go there, I think I'm better. Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself and stop worrying about what your friends or your family are going to say if you move away. It's not that you're trying to move up. this is not, oh, you moving? No, you're not. But I struggled in life.
Right.
I struggled. I had to make sure food was on the table, single parent, and all of that. And by the way, that $25,000, I paid every bit of it back plus, and I'm still with the same bank. You know, and with a credit score of 850 because I always paid my bills. You know, it's like, you know, but I'm OCD. I have to, every little thing, I have to tear out the car payment sheet and write the little number on everything. You know, yes. Yeah, you know, family, you got money, you go, well, how do I have money? Because I live in Schaumburg. I said, my family don't even know that I'm poor. Wow, I'm called the working poor. And without the leadership council, HACC, I couldn't survive. And that's the truth, and I owe a lot to them because I'm getting ready to retire, and they're still helping me, and I always appreciate it, and I never took the program for granted. I never take it for granted. A lot of people lost they vouchers and all this stuff because they took it for granted. They moved their whole family in or whatever, or wanted to work 3 and 4 jobs and not report. You can't do that. You know, taxpayers can help you with this. So I always look at their life like, hey, they helped me. I'm gonna show them that I appreciate it. I'm gonna do something with my life, and that's how I survive. And I'm counting down.
Michelle, are you seeing some of the same fears with your clients as well?
You know, well, I mean, I think that's why we, as far as the comfortability of living somewhere where you know already where the grocery stores are, where, you know, those tours or when we take some staff out, I think that is essential in helping alleviate some of, okay, now this is here's the apartment, now 2 blocks over there, let's take you down, there's Pete's, you know, grocery store, here are these, you know, this is a great cafe where, you know, we get coffee all the time, and then I think that helps, like, yes, it's a neighborhood. You know, it's interesting, I was talking with someone who grew up, was born and raised in Oak Park, and she went to Urbana for college. And she came back and she was just like, I was amazed that not everyone grew up in a neighborhood that was diverse and integrated. Because that's what Oak Park, I mean, there is no this section and that section. We really try hard to have everyone just live everywhere. But that was really eye-opening for her and for me because the work that we do, it's beautiful in that way, but then people go out and it's not like that everywhere, you know?
Yeah. It's almost a different set of perceptions you have to get over that.
Yeah, right.
Great. Well, just want to thank you all very much. And
So now we're at a point where we really want to talk about what can we all in this room do to further integration. We've heard from individuals who work in organizations whose mission is to really defy the odds of segregation. And we've heard from individuals who have made the truly courageous move to integrate. So now what can we do? So we're going to invite some policy experts up now to give us a snapshot of both the national and local fair housing landscape and fill us in on ways that we can get involved in really ending the cycle of segregation. So I'm going to invite up now Marisa Novara from the Metropolitan Planning Council and Nikita Brar of Chicago United for Equity.
Marisa Novara, I'm the Vice President with the Metropolitan Planning Council. How's that? Okay. Marisa Novara, I'm Vice President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. We are a planning and policy change organization. We work to create more equitable, prosperous, and sustainable Chicago region. And for the past 2.5 years, we, along with the Urban Institute and over 100 advisors and working groups, have been working on a project called the Cost of Segregation. Last year, we released a set of findings that quantified what it costs us to live so separately from each other in this region by race and income. And we found that it had a profound impact on lost income, lost lives, and lost education potential. And later this spring, we're planning to release a roadmap on a range of things that we think we can be doing about that. So I just have a few thoughts to share on that today, and I also was asked to give a little sense of kind of where we are nationally. So I want to just say a little bit about that, although that's an unfortunate part of the story. So one show of hands, since this is a group focused on this issue, how many people here were present back in 2015 when then HUD Secretary Julian Castro came to Chicago to talk about the affirmatively furthering for fair housing rule? Okay, great, I was too. And I remember my feeling that day was, wow, I cannot believe it took 50 years, almost 50 years at that point since the passage of the Fair Housing Act to actually get around to enforcing this notion that's really not a radical notion, which is to say that a municipality and a public housing authority that receive federal dollars cannot use those dollars to perpetuate segregation. So it took us, at that point, nearly 50 years and 15 HUD secretaries to get to the point where we were willing to say we actually believe in that, and we're actually willing to start putting rules and tools out there to do that and to begin even talking about enforcement. So I think the fact that it took that long for it to happen makes it even harder to believe that we're backtracking from that now. Many of us in the room have been working on plans for a regional assessment of fair housing that the 2015 rule required. And only to have the current administration delay that implementation and even prohibit localities from using federal funds to do that work. I'm happy to say that we are still, there's a group of us in this region still proceeding with that work regardless, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And again, this is at least consistent with an administration that has talked about efforts of lessening segregation as social engineering, which I think is an important mindset to just be aware of, because things like redlining and restrictive covenants were the original social engineering. And so I think it's really important to remember that when people use terms like that, to remember that we are going to have to be just as deliberate to dismantle our separation as people were in creating it in the first place. So what else has been going on at the federal level? Quickly, last month, the Department of Housing and Urban Development announced that their mission statement would no longer have a focus on inclusive and discrimination-free communities. New York Times just last week noted that the FHEO, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Division within HUD, has dropped multiple high-profile investigations into fair housing, including one into Facebook, which was being investigated for allowing discriminatory ads for housing on their platform. So now a group of 7 fair housing organizations are suing Facebook directly, since the federal government is not doing so. So given all of that, I think it makes it even more important for us to focus on what we can do to make this a more inclusive region. What are the things we can be doing ourselves? And I want to say kind of a basic philosophy that I think we have developed in our work on the cost of segregation, which is to focus on 2 things that we think we should be doing better as a region. And one is to talk about, I think no one in this region wants to be told that huge parts of our region are off limits to them. And if they wanted to move there, that they had no chance of doing that, and there's not a way for them to move if they want to. And at the same time, no one wants to be told that a community that they call home and is dear to them, that they would have to move that from that community in order to move up the economic ladder or to do right by their children or any of the other messages that we give people. And I think we need to do better by both of those groups of people. We need to be creating more diverse and inclusive communities for the people who want those, and we need to be investing more equitably across communities so that people who want to stay where they are and move up the economic ladder in place and continue to be community anchors right where they are can do that as well. So that's, I think, a kind of anchor philosophy that we've certainly brought to our work at MPC. And I want to highlight just a few things that are happening, I think, toward both of those ends. This is not an exhaustive list, but a few things. And then I have a few thoughts on directions to pursue. So I'm proud to say that despite steps backward from HUD, we have a robust group from this region who are proceeding with a Cook County-wide assessment of fair housing to assess the current state of fair housing issues and develop very community-informed plans to address them in a way that goes beyond just the one municipal border. And traditionally, that had been the way these were always done. And I really want to thank Enterprise Community Partners. They have stepped up to lead this effort, along with partners like CMAP and the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance. MPC is part of that work as well. And this is the first time we've done that, and it's really, there's more than 10 municipalities and at least 5 public housing authorities across Cook County. So it's a big step forward. When we no longer have a federal mandate to do it, we're doing it because it's the right way to move forward as a region, and we're excited about that. Another thing that is new, and I think is also really important, and this is being organized by my predecessor at the Metropolitan Planning Council, Robin Snyderman, who's now with Brick Partners. The idea is really kind of a proactive organizing effort around the region that says, affordable places to live can't just be a housing advocates issue. And we can't wait until a proposed development is in jeopardy to start asking people to be advocates for those issues. We need to start building relationships with anchor institutions and the business community in places around the region proactively as an organizing effort. I think employers have a self-interest in having a workforce across a range of skill levels and incomes nearby. They just sometimes need some help understanding that self-interest. And so the strategy that Robin and partners, including MPC, is developing is to engage and build relationships with those entities up front before something is in crisis, and help them understand that self-interest and kind of create a network that can be mobilized as we need it. Within the city of Chicago, I want to say I think we've seen some real progress on how we've thought about the enabling environment over the past 5 years or so. The strengthening of the transit-oriented development ordinance, strengthening of the affordable requirements ordinance are both things I would point to, where the city has said, for example, with the TOD ordinance, density near affordability is the way to go, and with that density, we need to include affordability on site. With the affordable requirements ordinance, I think there's been a real effort to say the areas where private market development is booming is where we need to push for the most on-site development. I also think that's a positive direction. But where do we go from there? I think if we're honest about pushing for what's next, I actually have an article out today about examining how aldermanic prerogative holds us back as a city. My basic argument is that the role for aldermen and community residents is in how affordable housing gets done and not if affordable housing gets done. And I think if we're serious about addressing our profound levels of segregation, then we need an all 77 community area strategy, and we need all 77 community areas to be open to providing a range of housing. And that means a range of incomes, it means a range of tenure, right? That single family homes are great, but when we have nodes of transit, we also know those are really special places where we can build density and we can get more units available at a range of incomes and available for different levels of ability and so on. And I also would just reflect, if there's anything I've learned over the last 3 years of our cost of segregation work, and in many ways I've learned this from and with many of our advisors, many of whom are here today, Nidra and Juan Carlos and Rob, Patricia, it's that diversity is not our end goal, and I would even say integration is not the end goal, because you can be diverse without being integrated, and you can be integrated without being inclusive. And Nikita has actually helped me quite a lot with thinking through this distinction, right? So you can be diverse without being integrated. You can be integrated without being inclusive. So here's an example. You could create a more integrated school, and most people would think, well, a more integrated school is a positive thing. But if in doing that, you don't also do implicit bias awareness training for teachers, parents, and students, if you don't also have a culturally responsive curriculum, if you're not also paying attention to things like achievement gaps and discipline gaps and so on, then we're really not hitting the mark. And so, since really segregation is rooted in racism, our key goal in our work, we've said, really has to be racial equity. And with that comes more integrated spaces. So how do we create more equitable and inclusive spaces is the bottom line question for us. And the final thing I would like to highlight is our own role as individuals. Our policies around things like housing choice vouchers and affordable housing units and where they can go and things of that nature are really important. But, and Rob Meyer has been one who's certainly pushed me on this issue, too often the start and stop of our work and discussions, that's too often the stop of, we talk about vouchers, we talk about affordable housing, and we don't talk beyond that. And I think that's leaving out a huge part of the discussion. And I've been reflecting on this a lot in the last couple days, actually, with the death of Linda Brown from Brown versus the Board of Education, of course, with the commemoration of Dr. King. So I just have two thoughts on that. Nicole Hannah-Jones had a really searing thread, I think, about Linda Brown and Brown versus the Board of Education. And she said, "We can all sit comfortably in the outrage of her explicitly being denied access to a school because of her race, even as we uphold housing policy, school choice programs, schools that require testing or screens, talented gifted programs that effectively keep most Black kids out." On the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, I've seen a lot written in the past couple days about kind of the whitewashing of his message, right? The de-radicalization of it to something that does not demand anything of us as individuals. And I read a piece by David Brooks in the New York Times where he said, many people support racial integration in the abstract, but they don't want to do the things that integration would require. So Maria and Kyle, you did an interview in Color Lines where the importance of our individual choices really stood out to me. You talked about the fact that where our parents lived and where we grew up has such a big impact on where we end up living. You called it the intergenerational transmission of segregation, which I thought was such an important term, right? We use that term, intergenerational transfer of wealth, is something you hear a lot about. I had not heard it talked about, the intergenerational transfer of segregation talked about in that way before. I appreciate you pushing the conversation to say that our perceptions, our social networks, our everyday experiences perpetuate segregation, and if we have children, we pass that on to them too. And as a white person, I think a lot about a comment that I heard last year at a conference where a presenter said, for so many white people, the experience of being a racial minority is so profoundly uncomfortable that they will arrange their entire lives to avoid being in that position, from where they work, to where they live, to where they go to school, to where they send their kids to school. And Nikita and I are listed as call to action. So, of course, as a policy person, I have lots of ideas about policy changes, right? We have 25 policy ideas in our roadmap that we'll be talking about later. But my other call to action really is a personal one, is a call to self-reflection about our own choices and our own actions and the impact of our actions regardless of our intent. So I will stop there. And
that's actually a perfect spot for me to pick up. So we've talked a lot about integration today, but I'm going to talk about segregation. And I want to talk about segregation because I think we need to understand the thing before we talk about what we're going to do about the thing. We need to talk about what's problematic about the thing in order to define what the actual solutions are to what we're trying to solve, right? So segregation is about power. It's a power structure. And it's a power structure that uses race in a very telling way to be able to disseminate power and keep power in the hands of those who already benefit from it. So if we're going to talk about power, we have to start by talking about what we are willing to give up from the power structure, from changing the power structure as it is. If you're in this room right now, one way or another, you benefit from the power structure because you knew that there was something happening downtown. You got invited into this room, and you happen to be sitting here right now. So I want you to take a moment, and this is not a hypothetical, I want you to actually take a moment right now and think about a privilege that you hold and how it has benefited you. Now I want you to think about what you're willing to give up in order to change the power structure that you're fighting. And you don't have to think about that in this moment. I want you to continue thinking about that, because the reality is, if you're not willing to give up power, you're not willing to do this work. And I don't want to continue having these conversations downtown with people who aren't willing to do the work. So that's an introspective question that you have to sit with, and you really have to sit and think about, what does it mean to give up the convenience of having a high-quality school in your neighborhood that you don't have to do much about or think much about to have your kids get a great education? What would it mean for you to actually take a chance at a school where things might not be going great and you might have to get more involved? And what might it actually mean to go a step further, to be part of that school community and to actually step back and say, if I'm a racial minority in the school community, but even more than that, if I'm a more privileged person in the school community, how am I going to center the needs of those who are most impacted here? How am I going to give up the space that I have so willingly taken in many places? So, in my personal narrative, I'll get into what Q is and what we do and stuff in a minute, but I think it's important to know people before you talk about what work you're willing to do with them. In my personal narrative, my husband and I settled into the South Loop a few years ago. We're both from an educator background, so we didn't look at schools when we decided where to live. We looked at the racial dot map, and both of us value having a racially diverse community. Myself, because I'm Indian American, and I'm always used to being the minority in the room unless I'm at a big Indian wedding, in which case I'm a minority in the room because I'm the one that's dancing the worst. So I'm used to that, but I also know that growing up in majority white spaces or predominantly white spaces, that growing up in those spaces, I was taught that the values and the power structure that I was trying to ascribe to in order to get ahead in life were based off of the lived experiences of white folks. So to dress in the way that I'm dressed right now, to be able to navigate the world and speak the way that I speak, all of those pieces, right, were things that I learned and picked up because of the structure I was in. And I didn't want my kid to grow up thinking that that was the only way to have power. I wanted him to find his, and I have a little boy now, I wanted him to find his way by knowing himself, being really well grounded in his identity, and knowing that he can find value and power in just being who he is, not trying to fit into something else. That's a fundamental reshaping of the way the world is. And I don't think I could articulate that a few years ago. And the only reason I'm able to talk about it in this way now is because I've been forced to live with the consequences of some of the choices I made. So I moved into a neighborhood that was racially diverse, but I moved into a school district, unbeknownst to me, that was majority black, adjacent to a racially diverse but high income school district, school boundary rather. And as a result, when push came to shove and displacement and disruption happened to housing markets, the schools are impacted as well. And so the expanding pressure on the housing market adjacent to my school boundary pushed into my school boundary in a way that the Chicago public school system said, we're going to take over this majority black, majority low-income school. We're going to turn it into a high school that's racially diverse. It's going to be a more acceptable option to the neighbors who have moved into the neighborhood and are looking for an option that is diverse but acceptable. So all of a sudden I was pushed into a situation where I was really asked a question, why do I value integration? Why do I value diverse spaces? And how am I going to push for equity, not for the thing that looks like equity, that deceives us into thinking we're doing the right thing? Fast forward, Chicago United for Equity is an organization that is focused on leadership development and action. So the way that we do that is we bring together people who care very deeply about the thing being equity, not the thing being diversity or any other sort of feel-good words, and talk about how to restructure power in ways that start very locally. And the reason we talk about this very, very locally is because, as Marisa pointed out, and as folks have talked about, federal government structures, all of those pieces, yes, that is real. But structures that were set up in the neighborhoods of people who think that this power structure is acceptable, that's actually way more dangerous than we even recognize. So let me give you an example. Jim Crow policies were set up right, at a very hyper-local level. They were set up by folks who lost the Civil War and then decided that their generation after generation were going to continue to hold on to those values and run for water district boards and school boards and other smaller local level government in order to set up ways to actualize their beliefs. So fighting that means that you actually have to start with recognizing that this is happening in your neighborhood right now. In my neighborhood right now, it's happening on a neighborhood watch Facebook group, in the ways in which people talk about policing our neighborhood, the ways in which we talk about which parts of the neighborhood are acceptable or not, the ways in which we talk about the bond programs, right? But all of this is shaped through our networks, as we've learned today. So our focus is really thinking about how do we bring people together to build relationships that actually force them to question their beliefs. Because at the core of it, we have to figure out how to disrupt structures by building community power to challenge those structures. We're not going to do that unless we get to actually know each other. So it all starts with pretty basic narrative building and narrative understanding and exchange, and then going from there to understand policies that are deeply rooted in inequity and thinking about how do I benefit from this and how am I burdened or how are my neighbors burdened and why should I care and what am I going to do about it. So it's really thinking about if this happened to you. I'll tell you my experience sitting in the chair and listening to a lot of what happened today made me feel pretty emotional at certain points. I got choked up at points, I felt angry at points, and all of those emotions are important because they are rooted in anger and frustration at injustice, and you will not get to action without letting yourself feel those feelings. So I'll start.
Okay, thank you so much. You guys can stay there. I think this is how I can't see over this thing. But so we've heard just a ton of information throughout this morning, and I know I have a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of you in the room have a lot of questions for everyone who spoke today. So I want to invite up Maria and Kyle and our panelists. I think if we can just, I don't know how we can do it. If you guys want to stay here and take questions as well, and we can get you the microphone, just to make sure if you have a question for anyone who spoke today, that you can get your questions answered. So we have about 15 or 20 minutes here for that. So we're just going to open the floor for questions. Do we have a microphone out anywhere? Another microphone? No. Okay, so we're going to have to project. So if you can stand up and project your voice if you have a question. Yes.
Sure. So my name's Nidra Fierce, and I work in Greater Chatham, and that's a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. I work with Chatham, Avalon Park, Harvard Russian, and Greater Grand Crossing. Historically, African American community, historically diverse by class and education, African American community. And so one of the questions that we have, people always say, well, we would live in Chatham, but it's not diverse. So I can't, click my heels and make white people come to the south side, okay? So I appreciate your comments that we can have diversity even if we're not diverse, because Black people are not shocking monolithic. And so my question to the housing centers is, so one of the things that we're struggling with, Black people live in Chicago, and so we've experienced a population loss. And so we need to change that population loss by inviting people who I would call African American allies to our community. Chicago doesn't have a really good track record with doing that. But recently I went to Baltimore, and they were having a good track record with that, where historically African American communities, that they have gotten 10% white. People who were living downtown, couldn't afford the high prices of living in the preferred neighborhoods, and went to middle-class African American communities and lived there. And they were the healthy professionals who decided to live in those communities. And so I'm wondering what's the experience has been with these Oak Park Centers and others that have attracted people who I would call allies living in communities that don't necessarily look like it.
Well, years ago when the housing center, was formed, we were 99% white. So it took concerted efforts to bring in people that weren't white. And I think, times have changed in those 40-some years, but I think it would take concerted efforts. It would take meeting, not to brag too much, but we're actually doing technical assistance now to communities that are wanting to bring in diversity and are struggling with how best to do it. Now, as an organization that we feel has been successful with this, we can't just go in and say, hey, we have an idea for you. It has to come from the ground up. And I think that's the only way, like it happened in Oak Park over 40 years ago, that it can happen now, is with a group of committed, passionate people that want to see a change happen, and will do so with keeping everyone in mind. I don't know.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions on that point or other points?
Since I'm sitting up here conspicuously and having not said anything. Everybody hear me? Yes, great, thank you. So one of the frustrations, challenges of doing the research that Maria and I have done is really what we're trying to do is highlight the complexity of this process, right? So it's very simple to sit back and say, oh, it's all economics, it's all preferences, it's all discrimination. And what we're trying to highlight here is that it's very, very complex because people are shaped by their daily experiences, the media, and all of those kinds of things in building those assumptions about where they should and shouldn't live, right? So your question really highlights the need to challenge all of those little micro experiences that people have that lead them to believe that they should be avoiding some places and they should be living in other places. It's an incredibly complex thing, but it also provides us an opportunity of kind of on a daily basis to make a change on all of those things if we recognize the power of those micro interactions and challenge the assumptions that are kind of embedded in all of those interactions.
We had a question in the far back corner. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Can you stand up?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I work with the Housing Authority of Cook County, and I work with Ms. Johnson, Housing Choice Partners. Everyone's doing good enough, huh? Okay. I work with Ms. Johnson with the Housing Choice Partners, and we get people from Chicago. Now, the thing is, I live in Chicago. I've lived in Chicago all my life, and I work with Cook County Housing Authority. So I'm taking people who are trying to run from Chicago and get out. It's crime. It's when I'm doing because I work for community choice programs where we do mobility part, where we put people in opportunity areas. So I'm listening to people and they're saying, oh my God, I gotta get out of Chicago. I live there. So it's a little difficult. As a community person in Chatham, in the beginning I moved from Woodlawn to Chatham, if you have any idea what Chicago is like. Had to get out of Woodlawn because we had a drug dealer living right across from me. The grandparents died, so they inherited the house. My mom stands about this tall, she doesn't take any crap. So if you're standing in front of her house, she's gonna go out there. And I have to protect that little woman. So it got difficult, so we moved to Chatham. 2005, had like 2 years, peace and quiet. I could walk down the street at 3 o'clock in the morning. The store stayed open on the corner 24 hours. If I wanted ice cream because I was watching scary movies, I'd go there. But things changed drastically. When I have block club meetings in Chatham, my thing is I have to enforce them and tell them, hey, if we want change, we have to do something ourselves. I mean, we have to first bind this block, then expand out. So it's difficult for me to tell them that because grandparents that used to own those houses died off. and we have a new generation who owns the house. So the priorities are different and directed at, I'm gonna worry about my family. And they don't look at the whole community as a family. So it's a challenge. It's not so easy as said, and I know you guys are doing great, changing policies and putting out books. It's great. But we have to trickle that down where it's absorbed within each and every one of us. I let people know in my workshops that it's not Schaumburg. Schaumburg shut the door in our faces when they saw us coming. What are you doing here? Who are you people? And you know, I put my badge out there, housing authority. I know what your house looks like before you painted it last year. So they have to kind of, we snuck people in through the back door. You know, shh, just gonna let you get in there. Schaumburg is one of the biggest cities that incorporated our clients now. I mean, I don't know how we did it, but I did it kind of out of ignorance too. You know, I didn't know that it was, my mom was a Martin Luther King follower believer, and she put that in me. So I thought it was over, you know, but no, it's not. When I got in the mobility program, it was about 2 years ago. So I still see that it exists. You know, people still want to be segregated. And it's just a harsh reality. We have to do it first with each and every person that's here and then transfer it over. That's what I do at my block club meetings. So that's all I had to say.
Gloria, do you want to respond to that as a Schaumburgian?
I've spoken to a lot of people who have vouchers, and they feel, a lot of people that do not, they even say, they feel that, they ask me, why did you go to Schaumburg? Or we don't belong out there. Who was we? Why don't belong out there? Don't have the right to live what I want? You know, if I'm able to pay the rent or whatever like that, but a lot of people feel that they want to stay with their own. They want to stay with their own breaks or whatever like that. And you can't change people's minds. They say, oh, we feel like I feel, you know, I don't think about it, I just live wherever. People are just like that. This is how they was raised. You need to live around your own, and this is how you was raised. So you feel that way, and they're afraid to live out there in Schaumburg, Arlington Heights, Palatine, whatever. Let's go to the south suburbs or whatever. Then they run from the south suburbs. They always say there's too much crime or whatever like that. But that mentality of we have to stay together, that's one of the problems and stuff. And I never felt that way. I always felt that I was an individual, and you can't make people be individuals and say, and I never wanted to tag on to people. Oh, if you go here, I'll go there. You know, in Schaumburg, it's kind of hard sometimes. It is kind of hard, you know, because you treated very well, but you're on your own. You're on your own. And people so far away from their families or whatever, that's a problem too, you know. People look at that, you know, well, why you live out there with those white people? White people? I'm not living out there with white people, I'm living on my own. I don't think about it, you know, as simple as that. Boy, it's hard to send people so far away from their families, and I do understand that, but it's a choice. It's just a choice. It's very hard. You know, they're used to the city where they get plenty of help or whatever, you know, they move out here to strangers that they just don't know. And if you live, you're 25, 30 years old, you live around your own race for years and years and years, and you go to a completely different, there's more blacks moving to the area as I speak right now. There's so many blacks live in the west suburbs. But then people want to move out, but it's just too many white people out here. If people can get away from that, then you can move on.
Yes, back there.
Yeah, so I really appreciate all the comments today. I do want to push back a little bit about this idea that you live somewhere with only people of your own, that it's detrimental. I'm speaking specifically from coming from an immigrant household. It was important for our immigrant family to be in an area where we could purchase ingredients for the food that we wanted, phone cards so we could call back to West Africa. And if we lived in communities that didn't have those things, we would have lost a piece of our culture. So I believe in integration and, you know, desegregation and diversity, but I do think it is important to keep that cultural balance as well in the communities that you live in and your networks.
I think that's a very important point. And if you want to have anyone respond to that.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to this, but I can just figure out this There we go. Yeah, so this is an issue that is highlighted in all three of the last comments, actually, about the relative importance of moving people somewhere else versus investing in communities. And so we talked a lot about, how do we change people's mobility patterns with the assumption, the implicit assumption that the solution is to move people elsewhere, right? And there has to be that balance of moving people and investing in communities, right? So there has to be both of those parts. For me, the reason why coming up with a multi-pronged approach to combating segregation is because segregation is such an important tool for kind of hoarding those resources, right? So if the choice is to stay in a place that is continually disinvested, continually over-policed, continually underfunded, versus moving, that's problematic, right? So we want to find ways to invest in communities that equalize those resources, that allow us to not allow segregation to be a tool for hoarding resources, but also make people more conscious about the mobility decisions they make to replicate that segregation kind of moving forward, right? So both parts of that have to be an important piece of the puzzle. I'm coming from the city of Seattle. A lot of you might know about the city of Seattle, one of the hottest housing markets in the country. It's a place where communities of color have been displaced out of the city of Seattle. So there are neighborhoods in the city of Seattle that were at one time in an era where the city was 5% African American, the neighborhoods were 85% African American. So incredible concentration of very vibrant Black communities that are completely gone now, out of the city of Seattle. The risk of integration here, if we don't have concerted efforts to invest in communities and invest in means to maintain that integration and to maintain the kind of the cultural integrity of those neighborhoods, is that we move people in and basically perpetuate segregation through this displacement process. So the community investment part has to go hand in hand with the mobility part, absolutely.
Nikita?
Yeah, I think that's a really important comment. I'm glad you made it. I think that this is something that was really important to our organization as we were developing out a model of what we think the right supports are when people are coming together to tackle issues of inequity and defining inequity. So we really wrestled with what is the definition of equity. There's the equity, equality, all that jazz that's talked about often. But what we've kind of landed on is that the difference between equality and equity is the difference between intentions and impacts. So if you look at just intentions and good intentions and thinking about, hey, I'm treating everybody the same, like that's your equality piece. But if you actually look at the outcomes that people experience, that's the equity piece. So if I have a bucket of, if I have two different groups, Group A is disproportionately impacted by asthma rates, has higher likelihood of dying by the age of 65, has lower performing schools, right? And that group has disproportionately larger number of Black folks. That is racial inequity, I can say that. So flipping that to say, I'm trying to move towards a world that is more equitable, is to say that no matter where you live, whether you live in a community with people who look like you, or whether you live in a community that is diverse, if I put two buckets of folks together and I compare the outcomes of their lives, they should be the same. Right? That's not every individual who's going to make it, in whatever metric of success, but that the communal outcomes should look about the same. So when you think about it that way, I think people tend to, first of all, what it does is it switches this conversation of intention, because a lot of folks are really upset when you start talking about racial inequities, because they feel like what you're really saying is that they didn't do their job in terms of having the right feelings. And we're not talking about the right feelings. Feelings are great. We want to talk about feelings. We want to make sure that we're building bridges, all of that. But if that doesn't get us towards more equitable outcomes, like your feelings did nothing for me. So that's kind of how we think about that, and it's also how we model our programs. So we look at two pieces of our work. We work directly with government and institutional stakeholders to use racial impact assessments to evaluate their outcomes. and to say where can we interrupt decision points where things are not equitably, the structures are not equitably serving the community, right? So we work with government folks, but we also serve the community, and we work directly with community stakeholders to help ensure that there's strong accountability, because this all goes back to power. If folks in the community don't have the power to change things locally, then that's never ever going to be an equitable structure. If it's just a couple of elected officials who care about this stuff, it's never going to work.
I think we do have time for one last question or comment. Oh, yes, you.
So yes, I appreciate what you just said. I just really think that, like, I feel like sometimes I get started feeling like a lot of these programs or proposed ideas are more like band-aids to like a bigger problem or solution. I do wholeheartedly believe that I don't necessarily feel like infusing different races is like the end all be all. It does have to be a big hand in hand with improving neighborhoods. But this, I'm not that familiar with there was a person on the panel who moved to Austin, and there was a role that they were like, oh, it's kind of extension, I'm not sure. But how does that infusion work when, like, you basically hear like people of color moving into the suburbs and how it was like there was positivity and it was a good thing for them. But how does that necessarily work on the flip side? Like, how does that look with like a white person or a white family moving into Inglewood, you know, where the school system is not that great and violence is that great and there's heavily policing? Like, how does that work out? Does that happen? How do you convince them? And does that translate into, if that does happen, more white people are moving into that neighborhood? Is that like the rest gentrification happening? Oh, we got a few white faces in there, now we're going to put a Whole Foods and a Starbucks. No, rent is going up, and, you know, like, so that was my question.
Did everyone hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. Does someone perhaps want to respond from Oak Park Regional Housing Center?
You want me to go? So I work with Michelle at the Housing Center. I'm the director there, and this is a question we ask ourselves all the time because we actually do not only work in Oak Park. We've been for the last 2 or 3 years working in Austin as well. And so what that means is that when we start to do things that are really efforts to reinvest in Austin and to revalue Austin, and when I say that, I mean we're reinvesting because the community has had considerable amount of disinvestment over the last 40 years, 50 years. Revaluing is more about, does everybody value Austin? Because the folks who live there love their neighborhood and they love where they live. So as we work on those issues together, we've been very adamant that this has to happen in a way where the neighborhood itself, and Michelle sort of talked about this previously, that the neighborhood itself has to determine for us what our role is in that community. We don't come in and say, hey, this is what you should do, and we're going to do it for you. We come in and say, we've noticed that these things have happened. We've heard from many of you about these concerns. We have some programs that might be able to help. Do you want our help? And if you do, how do we do that? And so as we go through that process, we are considering like what would change Austin to make it feel more desirable and more attractive, and make property values feel more stable and people feel like they're living in the community they really want to achieve. But that doesn't mean that it has to change, like flip from one thing to another. It can be a more moderate change, and it has to continuously be informed by the people who live in the community. So when we work with folks, they tell us, for instance, we need more investment for housing rehabilitation because we have a lot of homes that are in disrepair. Okay, well, let's see what we can do to figure out how to put programs together that will do that for you. We have a lot of renters who want to become homeowners, they don't have money for down payment. How can we work with them on that? Those sorts of things. How can we make the traditional residents stronger in the community? At the same time, we want to bring new people in because Austin lost 20,000 people over the last 10 years. So that's a big part of why you can't get a business started in Austin, why you can't get the infrastructure improvements you want in Austin, because there's not enough people to advocate for their own community and to support their own community. There should be, but it's hard. And so there's new people who are going to come in, but as we bring those new people in and we think about, well, what can we do to make sure that people of all races want to live in Austin? they also have to recognize that they have to respect the people who live there for a much longer period and who have done the hard work to keep the neighborhood as a desirable place. So they can move in, but they have to be respectful about the fact that there are people who live there already who, as we tell them, their opinion matters more than yours. They have a history here. They know more. They're better informed. And so you have to find those kind of people. And it's not easy, which is why, it takes a lot of money and a lot of hard work to make that happen. But if you do it right, you can actually start to build a new community of folks who include traditional residents and new residents working together.
Thank you. And, yeah, real quick. Yeah.
I just wanted to address one other part of your question, which I had a similar, a version of a question I asked by someone else who's in this room at a previous event that I've been thinking about the answer ever since. She was a white person and she said, well, I just moved and I'm thinking about where to live and where do I go and not be a gentrifier. And I think that sometimes we overplay as individuals and as white individuals overplay the impact of our presence anywhere, right? I lived for more than a decade in North Lawndale, and I didn't gentrify squat, right? My house, I still own my house in North Lawndale because it's still underwater. What I did do while I was there was join my local block club and become part of my community, become part of Lawndale Community Church, worked at a local community development corporation to build affordable housing in that community. And I think that's part of what I mean when I say what's our own personal kind of reflection about the steps we're taking about where we live and the kinds of attitudes we bring to where we live about the part of a community that you can become.
Ultimately, I think the problem is how do we get things to be evenly done across the playing field. That way it's not a matter of, okay, I'm white, I'm gonna stay here because it's more here versus not here. How can we get things evenly across the board? That way everybody of every different race have more of a choice of where they want to stay because you have your grocery stores, you have your shopping locations, so you have that the tax dollars being balanced out because you have your grocery stores and you have your clothing stores. How do we do that versus saying, okay, we have Bolingbrook, this is where the money is already at, let's move more black people here so they can benefit. How about we focus on areas that are really damaged, like Inglewood is getting better actually. Hyde Park is getting, it's always been better, but even better because Obama stayed there. How do we avoid areas being escalated to a different level because a politician stayed there or this person was from there? Let's start where it doesn't exist, make it happen, and then anybody can stay wherever. It wouldn't matter at that point.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And also want to say that previously, it just seems like it's building this narrative that the communities of color need the white people to come in to save us, or if they need to get out, we need to send them to the communities of white people to be saved. And so we're putting a Band-Aid on the situation right now to try to, alleviate the issues that are coming from legislation that are creating these segregated and unevenly equitable, communities or whatever. But this just made it seem like, again, the white people are the saviors, and they're saving black people by moving into their communities or pulling them out and bringing them to their own communities. And so if there's another alternative or another way to kind of think about it.
I think you're exactly right, and we do have to wrap it up, but it's who has traditionally been burdened by integrating? Who has traditionally benefited from segregation? And I think we've kind of touched on so many different points, from individual moves to power structures and policies, and it's so much, and I could just tell even in this room, like we all have a lot that we want to discuss with one another and kind of work through, and I feel terrible that we don't have the time to do that, but I really urge you to connect with each other in this room, connect with the folks that have spoken today. Where's Sarah at? Sarah Delgado. So we're with Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance. If you would like to continue the conversation, please pull one of us aside. We can connect you with the speakers. We can connect you with our network of folks who are like thinking about this issue all the time from all of these different layers, because I know, I mean, it's a lot. So at that, I think we should give a round of applause to our speakers for today. And let's keep the conversation going with one another. Thank you so much.